Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's definitely there. Right? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. Wa barik wa sallim. So today, Alhamdulillah, I feel like the summary today is almost kind of, I won't say redundant, but I'll say that Sheikh Amin already gave us the summary. Today was kind of like a summary, right? So Sheikh Amin, he mentioned two main principles that we extract from the surah, right? Do you remember what those two principles were?
Follow the rule of Allah.
I think that was one, right? So follow the rule, okay? And then before that was have to have the passion, right? Or to this one thing is to despise disbelief, right? And everything that it stands for, right? And so that was the first principle. And the second principle was to follow the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? So much of our lecture today was about how to navigate the interplay between these two principles. Okay? So Sheikh Amin, he gave a few very good examples. Okay? So he started off with I would say larger examples, and then he kept making them more and more relevant to our day-to-day lives, right? And I think like as the examples became more relevant, then the points started to settle better and better, right? Okay, so he started off with like a really large example, right? So for example, I mean, from a macroscopic perspective, right? So for example, he talked about the Camp David Accords, right? So how does that fit in these two principles? Okay, one is that we despise kufr, we despise disbelief, we despise everything that Israel is doing, right? We also despise, whether you want to call it the complicit nature of Egypt's relationship with the, with the ongoing, genocide and of our oppression of our Muslim brothers and sisters in Palestine, right? That's principle one, that you have to despise that. Okay, but principle two is that you have to follow the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that if you have entered a treaty, right, then you have to honor the treaty. Okay? Is it wrong that Egypt made that treaty? 100%. Right? They shouldn't have made that treaty. Right? Should they go back, renegotiate the treaty, so on and so forth? Okay, do whatever you need to absolve yourself of that treaty through the due legal process of doing so. Yes, absolutely. That's on them. That's on their shoulders. They need to do that. But can we beat the drums of maqasid al-sharia? Right? So this is actually, I use this terminology. This is terminology that Sheikh Amin uses. Right? Is that today in our community we have a trend where we want to bypass usul. Right? You want to bypass the principles, and the way that we want to bypass the principle is like, well, brother, sister, don't look at the nitty-gritty of the Sharia, look at the larger picture, right? And often that larger picture is what? It's very emotionally driven, right? Is driven by passion. But our brothers are being massacred, but they're being, this, that, so on and so forth, right? So the greater good, right? Air quotes, right? The greater good over here is, you should break the treaty. Okay? Now that's not following the hukum, right? And that's not understanding the interplay of the dynamics between these two principles. Okay? So should we despise the fact that, this Muslim country is in this agreement? Yes. Should we despise the fact that they are not renegotiating or absolving themselves of this treaty? Yes, we should. But should we seek and promote and justify and now say it's okay to break that treaty? See the question there? Right? If we say that, okay, in this circumstance, because of, given circumstances, it's now okay to break the treaty. Okay? That's not usuli. That's not following the principle. That's not following the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? So you can't play the drums of the greater good and say, by playing the drums of the greater good, I feel very passionate about this. Therefore, the ruling of Islam should now bend. Okay? There needs to be elasticity here. Right? So like where there is elasticity, there's elasticity, right? But when you have a foundational principle such as al-Muslimuna ala shurutuhum, that Muslims abide by their treaties, that's not something that can be bent, right? I mean, if you would imagine, the best example we have of this is, like Sheikh Amin mentioned today, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, right? I mean, was it not difficult on the Sahaba to turn back Muslims and send them back to Mecca? Of course it was difficult. This treaty is just signed. You have a companion that comes, has escaped his, disbelieving slave owner, right? And saying, take me with you, I'm a Muslim, is the ink has yet to dry. And the Prophet ﷺ says, Muslimun ala shurutihim, right? We have to abide by our treaties. Right? So did the Prophet ﷺ not care? Of course he cared. Right? Did he not have, did he not have concern for that person? Of course he did. Right? But it's a matter of principle. This is the hukum of Allah. Allah said that this is what you need to do. Right? So that there's no bending of the principle there. Right? So that was one example that I thought, and I think that's something that many of us probably we appreciate about Shaykh Amin's tafsir, is that it's not just theoretical, right? He'll mention the theory, but then he'll also bring in like real life examples that we can kind of like relate to. Okay. And the second example, right, that one of the other examples that he gave was, for example, you have demonstrations, right? Demonstrations for justice. Okay. Do we despise the injustice? Yes. Right? Do we encourage people to demonstrate and use all means that they have at their availability to express in legal ways, in legally permissible ways, their frustration over this injustice? Yes, absolutely. Okay. But should the despising of this injustice trump, praying salah on time? No. Right? Can a person, say like, well, I have to sit in over here, okay? And part of that sitting in means that, if I, for some reason, run out of enough water to make wudu, you know what? This is a much greater cause, so therefore it's okay. I can just make tayammum and I'll pray. No faqih will ever sign off on that, okay? Right? Because in your understanding, that passion is swelled till the extent where now you're willing to sacrifice the hukum of the Sharia. Right? You can't sacrifice the hukum of the Sharia. You can't give up salah. Right? And if you can't give up salah, you also can't give up what are requirements of salah, such as being pure. Right? Do you have access to properly use the restroom and clean yourself afterwards to be pure? Right? You can't say, well, it's for the greater good, so you know what, it's okay. Like, number one, that sounds horribly disgusting, right? Okay, but beyond that, right, is that the interplay of despising injustice, but also keeping in mind that I have to follow the hukum. Right? Okay. So that was another example that he gave. And then towards the end, right, he gave the example of, I really like this one, of a person, because the reason I say I really like this one is because I've heard many variations of this, of people coming to myself and asking this, right? And often the outline of this argument is, well, we're living in a non-Muslim country, right? And if we want to flourish as a Muslim civilization over here, we need to have power, right? We need to have financial power, we need to have political power, okay? And to do so, we may need some dispensations to accumulate and accrue that power, right? The example that Sheikh Amin he gave was that, okay, well, there's a person that's working in, a corporation, right? And now we're not questioning this person's sincerity, or we're not questioning this person's intention, right? It is very possible that this person sincerely wants to reach the top so that he can help Muslims with being in that position, right? But it's the classical position of, do the ends justify the means, right? That's always going to be that question there, right? So for us, that discussion is very simple, that if to reach the end you have to break the hukum of Allah, then the usuli perspective and the usuli narrative says, no, you can't do that. Okay? So if that means that you have to, right? And I think part of that, as we always do, is connected to aqidah, right? It's connected to aqidah because the question is, who's telling you to take the burden of the end on your shoulders? Okay? Right? So meaning your job is to try, right? Whether Muslims get the power, they reach the end or not, right? That's not your job, right? And nor is that how we justify whether it's successful or not. Okay? And that's what Sheikh Min was mentioning when he says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la tatawallaw qawman ghadiba Allahu alayhim. Right? That, oh, you who believe, don't take as allies a people who Allah's anger is upon. Right? And then, we do tafsir of the Quran with the Quran. You go to غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ. Right? And before that, صِرَاطَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ. Right? So we ask Allah to put us on the path of those He has given His ni'mah. Right? Now, how do we understand ni'mah? The ni'mah is to be on Islam, to be a Muslim. That is the ni'mah. Okay? And what is the sign of Allah being angry with someone? That they're still on disbelief. Right? So what Shaykh Amin was pointing out was that ni'mah, or blessing, and conversely Allah's wrath and His anger, is not represented by how well you're doing in the dunya, right? So whether to put it in, kind of bring it to our example, if you reach the top of the corporate ladder, that doesn't necessarily mean an'amta alayhim, right? That doesn't mean that that's the ni'mah. And if you don't make it to the top of the ladder, that also doesn't mean maghdubi alayhim, okay? Rather, what it means is, as long as you're doing what's within your means while following the hukum, right, and you're trying to get to the top to help Muslims, then you're an'amta alayhim. Okay? But if you try to reach the top, and let's say you do reach the top, but in getting to the top you sacrifice the hukum, right? Then may Allah protect us, that's maghdub alayhim. Right? So I think he kind of laid it out very nicely in that sense, right? That how do we see, an'amta alayhim, right? What do we think of, when we think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessing is on someone, right? And versus Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's displeasure is with someone, and His anger, right? And how do we kind of navigate this, the interplay of these things, right? Okay. Inshallah, we'll open up the floor for questions. Inshallah, so anyone has questions or discussions, inshallah, we can open that up now. Inshallah. Ibrahim, you had mentioned some good points in the beginning. Maybe we could, for the benefit of everyone that's online, inshallah.
Sure. I think a couple of reflections as you were reflecting. One is there is no good greater than the good of a successful experience in the akhirah, right? And so that was, I think Sheikh Amin emphasized that a little bit, and I think here for our purposes, like that's also relevant, because framing the greater good as anything other than success in the akhirah becomes problematic, and if you can ground in that, then the other pieces become easier. I think a lot of times it's just difficult. You're like, well, but there's so much good I can do if I just take this shortcut. And I think you have to reframe that conversation. The other area that I think is useful to explore is also in like how we engage in this practical manner of like, you can't make those judgment calls on, is this part of the hukam or is this not part of the hukam, if you don't have the knowledge or you don't have the resource to give you the knowledge. And I think that is probably, I know this is a big part of the mission here within Darul Qasim, but I think that's a big sort of missing piece for a lot of folks, is that they are making the best judgment that they can based on something that they heard somewhere, but lack, that proper knowledge of what is, even the conversation that we were having around like, what is considered being alone with somebody, right? What is sort of the definition of that? And most people don't, and myself included, don't have the details of like, all right, well, how do you let's define that, right? Where are the actual usuli boundaries inside of our religion that fall within the hukam or not? Where are the quote unquote gray areas? What determines haja and need, right?
Yeah.
And then I think that's that context is missing for a lot of people.
Good. Yeah, very good. MashaAllah. So Brother Ibrahim brought up a very good point about, and actually that's kind of where we had stopped our conversation before we went live, was that, like that's actually part of the mission of Darul Qasim, right? That we are producing, we have students in Iftā, right? That are studying Iftā in the States, so they have the context of the States, right? So I think that is something that is, that is, like you mentioned, Brother Ibrahim, that is a vision of Darul Qasim, right? Because it's one thing to say that, okay, you have to act according to the hukum, right? But then for many times, someone might not know, okay, well, what is the hukum in this stance, right? So I think one thing is to say that, okay, we need to follow the hukum, okay? And when the mufti gives the hukum, right, don't be upset at him if he gives you something that you don't like, okay? But I think Brother Ibrahim pointed to something that's very important, is having access to Muslims' academic scholarship, right, or Islamic academic scholarship. And that is something that, we try to provide at Darul Qasim. Okay, we have a question here that about a non-Muslim woman wants to become Muslim, is married to a non-Muslim man. Do we delay her conversion? We don't delay the conversion. Okay, we never. There's always a list of priorities, right? Okay, so I think what's the question over here is, and we can frame the question this way. Okay, what's the kind of talking about what's the lesser of the two evils? Okay, the lesser of the two evils over here would be that, okay, perhaps she will live in sin, right? So let's say that, okay, if she becomes a Muslim, she stays married to that non-Muslim man, right? And the woman says, I'm not ready yet to separate, right? Whatever that case may be, that's at least sin, right? At the end of the day, according to Sunni creed, right, a person, even if they're committing a major sin, that doesn't disqualify them from entering Jannah. Okay, a Muslim will enter Jannah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might forgive them immediately, or may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us, they purify their sins through the fire. Okay, but eventually all Muslims that believed in the Shahada, right, and they believed in the Prophet ﷺ and his finality and those tenets of belief that one has to believe in, right, that is something that is assured for all Muslims. Okay, so now if we say that, okay, well, we're going to delay her conversion, that's dangerous because we don't know if she's going to live, right? Yeah. That's taking a very precarious assumption that, okay, she's going to live until even the next second. We don't know that. Okay, so when we are able to say if they're ready to take the Shahada, we don't delay in that. Okay, because no one knows when their end is going to be. Yes, we explain to them, right? And there's no one saying that you shouldn't tell them, right? We're not saying like, kind of like trick them into it, right? You explain to them, you talk to them, right? And you have a very honest conversation with them. We're not hiding the hukum, right? We're not hiding the ruling that, once you become Muslim, this is what's supposed to happen, right? You are supposed to separate. Okay, that's not something we're going to bend on. That's not something that we're going to. That's not something we're going to compromise. Okay, we're not going to compromise that, but that also doesn't mean we're going to say, well, if you know what, if you're not going to separate, we're not going to give you shahada. No, that's not how it works. Okay, so yeah, so like the kufr versus sinning contrast. Okay, so it's rather that, you know, we'd rather that, of course, we don't want anyone to live in sin, right? But we'd rather sin over disbelief, right? So that's how we would kind of frame that conversation, right? So a person doesn't know what they are really getting into, so that's part of the da'wah, right? Part of the da'wah is that, you know, you should, yeah, you should let them know that, okay, these are the things that are going to happen, so on and so forth. Okay, so yeah, so hopefully that that provides some clarification. Inshallah. Okay. سبحان الله بحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.